On graduation night, the sunset painted Riverside high in shades of gold and promise. Marcus stood on the football field, his graduation robe billowing in the warm June breeze, watching the ripples of his changes play out one last time before the inevitable pull of time took him home. His father sat in the bleachers, alive and alert, following a successful preventive surgery that Marcus had finally convinced him to get. Beside him, James's mother beamed, free from the shadow of her ex-husband, while Mr. Reynolds discussed his upcoming testimony before Congress about the financial algorithms he and James had developed. Sarah's protest art exhibition had made national news, turning Riverside's scandal into a symbol of systemic change. Her piece, The Price of Dreams, hung in the school hallway, different from any work Marcus remembered from his original timeline, but somehow more powerful. She caught his eye from across the field and smiled, touching the silver bracelet that now meant something entirely new. Rachel stepped up to the podium, her valedictorian speech notes trembling slightly in her hands. The poem she'd written the night of Marcus's confession had gone viral, spawning a student movement across the country. Not the same fame she'd had in his timeline, but her own voice, found years earlier, and all the stronger for it. The future, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, isn't a destination, it's a choice we make every day. Brad sat with his mother, their relationship healing in the wake of his father's arrest. The college admissions scandal had torn through the education system like a wildfire, but from its ashes, a more equitable system was emerging. Tony, having kept his football career intact, had turned down an athletic scholarship to start a student advocacy group instead. Marcus felt the familiar drowsiness creeping in, the same sensation that had brought him back to 2006. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He'd learned that changing the past wasn't about creating a perfect future. It was about giving people the courage to face their own truths. "Time to go back," Sarah whispered, appearing beside him. She'd known all along somehow that this moment would come. "How did you know?" She shrugged, her artist's eyes seeing more than she let on. "Some things you can't explain, like quantum physics in AP class, or knowing exactly when to save your friend from a car crash, or having the courage to expose a truth that needed exposing." The world began to blur around the edges as Rachel's voice carried across the field. "We are not bound by who we were told to be, but freed by who we choose to become." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the timeline shift one last time. When he opened them, he was back in his Manhattan apartment, but nothing was the same. His phone buzzed with messages from James about their nonprofit's latest project. Sarah's art filled his walls, different pieces than before, but still breathtaking. Rachel's new poetry collection sat on his desk, dedicated to the friend who taught us that destiny is a choice. And there, framed on his wall, was his graduation photo from 2006, surrounded by faces both familiar and new, all of them smiling with the knowledge that their futures were their own to write. The library smelled of dusty books and hidden possibilities. Marcus sat at his usual table, watching Rachel Chen, no relation, through the gaps in the shelving. In his original timeline, she'd become Rachel Chen Martinez, the voice of a generation, her poetry breaking open the discourse on Asian American identity. But that Rachel had emerged from the crucible of rejection and isolation. This Rachel still wrote her poems in secret, hiding them in a worn composition notebook between calculus problems. "You're staring again," Sarah whispered, sliding into the seat across from him. Her sketchbook was open to a new page, darker than before, all sharp angles and shadowed corners, the same style that would later define her breakthrough series, except it was happening years too early. "I'm not staring," Marcus lied, his adult mind warring with his teenage hormones. "I'm just planning another quantum physics miracle." Sarah's smile was teasing, but her eyes were shrewd. "You know, it's weird. Sometimes you talk like you're from the future or something." Marcus's heart skipped. "That's ridiculous." "Is it? Yesterday you mentioned Instagram. I Googled it. It doesn't exist." Before Marcus could respond, James burst into the library, earning a sharp look from Mrs. Crawford. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with excitement. "Guys, I did it. I convinced my mom to leave him. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In the original timeline, James's mother had stayed with his abusive stepfather for 3 more years. The resulting trauma had sent James spiraling into addiction. By changing this, Marcus might be saving his friend's life. But he was also erasing the experiences that had led James to become a counselor, helping countless others overcome their own addictions. That's amazing, Marcus managed, his voice thick. Yeah, and check this out. James pulled up his phone, showing a crude web page. I'm building this thing, like a social network, but for tracking patterns in the stock market. Mr. Reynolds is helping me with the coding. Sarah leaned in, interested. Like what you were saying about quantum uncertainty and market behavior. Exactly. Marcus got me thinking, if we can predict particle movement, why not stock movements? Rachel chose that moment to pass by their table, dropping a book. Marcus caught it reflexively. The collected works of Sylvia Plath. Their eyes met, and he saw in them the same darkness that would later fuel her most powerful works. She snatched the book back without a word. The butterfly effect, Marcus muttered, watching her retreat. What? Sarah asked. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Every change was a pebble in a pond, and the ripples were becoming tidal waves. He glanced at his watch, the same one his father would check for heart palpitations in 6 months' time. Time wasn't just flowing differently, it was flowing faster, and Marcus was no longer sure if he was its master or its victim. By third period, Marcus's quantum physics performance had already become the stuff of Riverside High legend. He sat in the cafeteria, watching his small act of showing off spiral into consequences he never could have predicted. James hadn't stopped talking about it, especially to their computer science teacher, Mr. Reynolds. But imagine if we could actually predict patterns like that, James was saying, his voice rising with excitement. Like with the stock market or whatever. His eyes darted nervously toward the cafeteria entrance, where his stepfather sometimes checked on him during lunch, a detail Marcus had forgotten until this moment. Marcus nearly choked on his pizza. He knew exactly where this conversation would lead. Mr. Reynolds would become obsessed with pattern recognition, eventually leaving teaching to pursue algorithmic trading. In the original timeline, he'd failed spectacularly, but not before inspiring dozens of students to explore computer science. Actually, Marcus interrupted, trying to redirect the conversation. I was thinking about the school newspaper. They need writers. But James wasn't listening. His eyes had that familiar intensity Marcus recognized from their college years. The same look he'd had before the cocaine addiction that would tear their friendship apart. My stepdad's been worse lately, James whispered. But if I could prove I don't need his money. Before Marcus could respond, Sarah Martinez appeared at their table, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. In his original timeline, she'd never spoken to either of them before graduation. Your physics solution, she said, placing her sketchbook down. It reminded me of something. She opened to a page covered in intricate spirals and geometric patterns. Marcus's breath caught. He recognized this piece. In 2023, it had sold for $2.3 million at Christie's, titled Quantum Dreams. But here it was, unfinished, just taking shape in the margins of a high school notebook. The way you described particle movement, she continued, it's exactly what I've been trying to capture. The uncertainty, the possibility of being in 2 places at once. James leaned forward, momentarily distracted from his schemes. This is incredible, Sarah. It's like if anxiety had a mathematics. Marcus watched the interaction with growing unease. In the original timeline, Sarah had created this piece after months of isolation and depression. Her art had emerged from that darkness. By preventing her loneliness, was he also preventing her genius? The cafeteria's fluorescent lights flickered, and for a moment, Marcus saw double. Sarah as she was now, and Sarah as he remembered her from a gallery opening 20 years later, confident and acclaimed. James, alive and hopeful, overlaid with the memory of him passed out in a college bathroom. Each small change he made was creating ripples, and those ripples were becoming waves. Tell me more, Sarah said, sliding into the seat next to him, while James pulled out his phone to research stock patterns. Marcus felt the timeline shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. He was no longer just rewriting his own fate, he was rewriting everyone's. 2 weeks before graduation, Marcus sat in Principal Davidson's office, watching his carefully reconstructed timeline crumble. The evidence of the admissions scandal lay scattered across the desk. Hundreds of doctored transcripts, fake recommendations, and financial records that Brad had turned in, despite knowing it would implicate his own father. "Mr. Chen," Davidson said, his face ashen, "I assume you understand the gravity of these accusations." The man's hands trembled as he shuffled papers that would eventually lead to his arrest, along with half the district's administration. "I understand everything," Marcus replied, the weight of his words hitting differently now. Through the office window, he could see students gathering in the courtyard, their protest signs catching the morning light. "Save our school. Education isn't for sale." And most painfully, the truth about Riverside, painted in Sarah's distinctive style. His phone buzzed. A text from James. "Mom's okay. Stepdad's taking a plea deal. But the stock prediction program, Mr. Reynolds found something bigger, way bigger. Turn on the news." As if on cue, Davidson's office TV flickered to life with breaking news. High school teacher uncovers major Wall Street fraud. Marcus's stomach dropped. Mr. Reynolds hadn't just been helping James with coding. He'd accidentally created an algorithm that exposed insider trading at multiple national banks. The door burst open. Rachel stood there, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. "They're shutting down the literary magazine, the arts program, everything. The funding, it was all connected to the scandal." "Let them," Sarah said, appearing behind her. She held up her phone, showing an email from a local gallery. "I submitted my work, my real work, not what I thought people wanted to see. They're giving us space for a student protest exhibition. We don't need their corrupt money to make art." Marcus's phone rang. His father's name flashed on the screen, sending a jolt of panic through him. The stress of the scandal had been all over the local news. In the original timeline, his father's heart attack had come after a much smaller crisis. Had Marcus just accelerated the timeline of his father's death? "This isn't just about college admissions anymore," Davidson said, his voice hollow. "This will destroy lives, careers, families." "No," Marcus stood, a lifetime of regret and second chances crystallizing into clarity. "This will save them." The protests outside grew louder. Through the window, he could see Tony organizing students, Brad speaking to reporters, James comforting younger students whose college dreams seemed suddenly uncertain. The future was unwritten now, dangerous and beautiful in its possibility. His father's call went to voicemail as Marcus made his choice. He'd come back to fix his own past, but he'd ended up giving everyone the chance to fight for their own future, even if that future was nothing like the one he remembered. The halls of Riverside High hadn't changed a bit, or rather, wouldn't change for another 2 decades. Marcus navigated through the chaos of first-period rush, dodging backpacks and bodies with the muscle memory of both a teenager and a time traveler. The scent of floor wax and anxious adolescence filled his nostrils, along with the artificial strawberry body spray that defined 2006 as precisely as carbon dating. His fingers instinctively reached for a smartphone that wasn't there, instead finding the rectangular bulk of his Motorola Razr. A group of girls passed by, discussing MySpace Top 8 drama with the gravity of international diplomats. Marcus caught his own reflection in a trophy case. His teenage face still felt like a stranger's mask. "Yo, Chen." The voice belonged to James Wong, his former best friend. "You look like you've seen a ghost, man." James dropped into the seat next to him in AP Physics, wearing a band t-shirt that Marcus recognized with a jolt. It would be ruined in a coffee accident next week, an accident that sparked their first real fight. Before Marcus could respond, another figure entered his peripheral vision. Sarah Martinez slipped into her seat 2 rows ahead, her dark hair caught in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. His heart did a complicated gymnastics routine. In his original timeline, Sarah had gone on to become a renowned artist, her work selling for millions. In high school, she'd been the quiet girl who sketched in the margins of her notebooks. the girl he'd never had the courage to really talk to. Today, Mr. Patterson announced, writing on the whiteboard, "We're tackling the quantum tunneling effect." He presented the class with an equation that had once reduced Marcus to tears. Now, with 20 years of hindsight and a physics minor he pursued in his quarter-life crisis, the solution blazed in his mind like a neon sign. His hand shot up before he could stop himself. The next few minutes were a blur of chalk dust and stunned silence as Marcus derived the solution, throwing in references to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that he definitely shouldn't have known yet. When he finished, Mr. Patterson's mouth hung open slightly, and Sarah had turned completely around in her seat, her sketching forgotten. That's graduate-level analysis, Mr. Chen," Mr. Patterson stammered. James whistled low. "Dude, when did you become beautiful mind?" Marcus felt the weight of 24 stares. He'd broken the first rule of time travel before first period was even over. Don't draw attention to yourself. But as Sarah's curious gaze lingered on him, a different kind of butterfly effect stirred in his chest. Maybe some attention wasn't such a bad thing. The class bell rang, sounding exactly like his alarm clock in 2024. For a moment, Marcus feared he'd wake up back in his apartment, but no, he was still here, still 17, still playing with fire in ways that could burn his entire future timeline to the ground. And strangely, he was starting to enjoy the heat. The abandoned textile factory loomed against the night sky, its broken windows reflecting the blue and red flash of distant police sirens. Marcus's confession hung in the air between them as they huddled behind Brad's Mustang in the gravel parking lot. "So you're telling us," Rachel said, her voice unnaturally calm, "that in your timeline, I become a famous poet?" She clutched her notebook tighter, knuckles white. "Because of pain I haven't experienced yet. And I become an artist," Sarah added, touching her bracelet, the one Marcus had just revealed she'd originally received at her first gallery opening, not as a homecoming gift, built on years of isolation you're preventing. James paced, his phone buzzing with updates about his stepfather's standoff with the police. "But you changed it for me. You helped me get my mom out early." His voice cracked. "Were you playing God with all our lives?" Before Marcus could respond, Brad emerged from the factory's side door, his Letterman jacket dusty from the file boxes. "You guys need to see this," he called, his usual bravado replaced by genuine fear. "My dad's been running this scheme for years. Half the college acceptance letters in our class are bought and paid for." Tony appeared behind him, clutching papers. "It's not just admissions. There's a whole network, test scores, athletic scholarships, everything. The principal, the superintendent, they're all in on it." Marcus felt the weight of multiple futures pressing down on him. In his original timeline, this scandal had never broken. Brad's father had continued running the scheme for another decade, affecting thousands of students' lives. But he'd also used his connections to fund the school's arts program. The program that had given Sarah her first exhibition space, that had published Rachel's first poems. "We have to turn these in," Brad said, surprising everyone. I can't live with this." Sarah studied Marcus's face. "What happens if we do? In your timeline, this never came out. What changes?" Marcus closed his eyes, remembering headlines from 2016. Local arts program faces closure. Youth Poetry Initiative loses funding. Riverside High's decline. A decade later. "Everything changes," he whispered. "But maybe it should." Rachel stepped forward, her quiet voice cutting through the tension. "You said my poetry came from pain. But maybe it's not the pain that matters. It's what we choose to do with it." She held out her notebook, open to a fresh poem. "I wrote this tonight, after you told us everything. It's different from what you remember, but it's still mine." James's phone buzzed again. His stepfather had surrendered to the police. Another future altered. "We're not our tragedies," he said. "He taught me that, Marcus." The sound of more sirens grew closer. They had minutes to decide, preserve the corrupt system that had inadvertently nurtured their talents, or tear it down and face an uncertain new future. Marcus looked at his friends, their faces both familiar and strange in this rewritten present, and realized that playing God wasn't about controlling their destinies. It was about giving them the chance to choose their own. "Marcus, you're going to be late for school." The familiar voice cut through Marcus Chen's consciousness like a blade through silk. His mother's voice, but not the gentle, aged tone he'd grown accustomed to. This was her younger voice, sharp with morning urgency, exactly as he remembered it from his teenage years. His eyes snapped open, and the world tilted sideways. Gone was his Manhattan apartment's Egyptian cotton and memory foam. Instead, his fingers clutched a worn Spider-Man comforter he hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. The air smell of his mother's coffee and something else, that artificial vanilla air freshener she'd been obsessed with in 2006. 2006. The thought hit him like a bucket of ice water. Marcus bolted upright, his heart thundering against his ribs. The bedroom around him was a time capsule. Walls plastered with Fall Out Boy and Green Day posters, a cluttered desk with a chunky Dell desktop computer, and, most jarringly, a full-length mirror that reflected a face he'd only seen in old photographs for the past 18 years. His 17-year-old face stared back at him, acne-scarred and wide-eyed with shock. "This is a dream," he muttered, but his voice cracked in that distinctive teenage way that no dream could replicate. On his nightstand, an iPod Nano lit up with LMFAO's party rock anthem, and his old flip phone buzzed with a text message from James, who he hadn't spoken to since their falling out during freshman year of college. Marcus stumbled to his desk, where a half-finished college application to Stanford Business School lay scattered among crumpled rejection letters from Columbia's journalism program. The sight of them made his stomach lurch. These papers, these rejections, had set him on the path to becoming an investment banker instead of the writer he'd always dreamed of being. "Marcus," his mother's voice again, closer now. "Your father's already left for work, and you still haven't had breakfast." His father. The thought struck him like lightning. Dad was alive. In 2006, his father was still 2 years away from the heart attack that would change everything. The door creaked open, and there stood his mother, 20 years younger, her hair still jet black without a trace of gray. She wore the blue nursing scrubs he remembered so vividly from his high school years, before she'd given up her career to care for his father. "First day of senior year," she said, her expression softening. "Don't want to start it late, do you?" Senior year. The words echoed in his mind as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Somehow, impossibly, he'd been given a second chance at the year that had defined his entire future. The year of missed opportunities, of paths not taken, of words left unsaid. Marcus looked down at his teenage hands, then back at the college applications on his desk. A strange calm settled over him as the initial panic faded into purpose. This time, he was going to get it right. The bass from the homecoming dance thundered through Riverside High's gymnasium, but Marcus stood in the parking lot, checking his watch for the 100th time. 9:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, in the original timeline, Tony Mitchell would borrow his father's car, take a curve too fast, and end his promising football career in a guardrail. "You're being weird again," Sarah said, appearing beside him in a midnight blue dress. Her silver bracelet caught the streetlight, the same bracelet that would inspire her Reflected Memories series, except she wasn't supposed to own it yet. Marcus had noticed her wearing it yesterday, another anomaly in the increasingly unstable timeline. "I need to find Tony," he said, scanning the crowd of students filtering between the gym and the parking lot. "Tony Mitchell? He left a few minutes ago with Brad Martinez. Something about his dad's Mustang." Marcus's blood ran cold. Brad wasn't supposed to be with Tony in the original crash. Which way did they go? "Marcus, what's going on?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "First the physics equation, then the Instagram slip-up, and now you're acting like you know something bad is about to happen." Before he could respond, James burst out of the gym doors, his tie askew. "Guys, we have a problem. My stepdad showed up at the house. Mom called, he's drunk and making threats. He found out about our stock prediction program, thinks we're trying to scam him or something." Rachel appeared behind them, still in her library aide uniform rather than formal wear. "The principal's looking for you, James. Something about unauthorized use of school computers." Marcus's head spun. None of this had happened before. His changes were cascading, creating a perfect storm of altered events. His phone buzzed. A text from Tony. "Dude, you were right about the curve on Miller's Road. Brad almost killed us." Relief flooded him, immediately followed by fresh panic as he read the next message. "But you'll never believe what we found in his dad's office files. The whole college admission system is rigged. Brad's freaking out. Meeting at the old factory to figure out what to do." "I can explain everything," Marcus said, turning to Sarah, whose suspicious expression had hardened into certainty. "But right now, we need to get to the abandoned factory on Elm." "Not until you tell us what's really going on," Sarah demanded. "And don't try that quantum physics metaphor again. You're not just good at math, Marcus. You're different. Like you know things you couldn't possibly know." The air grew thick with tension as James and Rachel moved closer, forming a circle around him. In the distance, police sirens wailed, probably heading to James's house. Marcus checked his watch again. 9:52 p.m. The timeline was unraveling faster than he could track it, and he was finally out of time to keep his secret.